Okay, I will call the meeting to order at 1:34. Let's go around and do introductions. I'm Bo, HPI board and KY tenants. Bruce.
Yeah, okay. Bruce Davis, HPI board.
Christina Ellison, New Beginnings Bluegrass.
Dylan Shell, New Vista.
David Chad, Hope Center.
Margaret Ballard, IT.
Jordan Lloyd, just wanting to learn some more.
Erica Dominguez, Lexington Rescue Mission.
Marissa Webb, Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention.
And I'm Jeff Herron, manager of LFUCG's Office of Homelessness Prevention and Intervention. Just a reminder or announcement, please do, if you're going to speak during the meeting, turn on your microphones. I know it's a little bit awkward since we're in a room together, but the audio does provide a recording for our meeting minutes, so it is helpful to the staff that does that for us. All right.
Okay, first thing on the agenda is a review of the minutes from October 25th. Are there any comments or discussion? Can we get a motion to approve?
It's a full COC vote.
I'll make a motion.
Okay. David's a motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
All right, all in favor signify by saying aye or raising your right hand. Any opposed? Great. Now on to new business. First is Jeff with recruitment of new COC partners.
All right. Thank you, Bo. So Marissa and I are just trying to make sure that we do some follow-up on items that we had some intended work to do around different strategies that we were identifying as we were working on the continuum of care application in the fall. And want to make sure that we continue to move some of those items forward throughout the year. So one thing is thinking about just opening the discussion if there are individuals or organizations that we feel like are kind of missing from the table in terms of COC meetings and participation. My office would be glad to go ahead and reach out to them, invite them to participate. Additionally, at some times in the past, we've had an advocacy meeting dedicated to bringing a friend or inviting another partner agency to attend and just get a little bit more familiar with us and what we do. So definitely that's something that we would also be glad to look at if we wanted to dedicate a meeting of this committee or one of our other meetings to potentially making that more of kind of an open house where you can bring additional persons with you so that they can get introduced to the continuum. Does anybody have any thoughts around folks that we need to be actively reaching out to?
I think the medical providers are never represented, but like Health First and Bluegrass Community Health both have, clinics in shelters and day centers. So having them here would be helpful.
Technically members.
Yeah, right. Right.
But yeah, I can follow up on that. I know, for example, I participate in a group called BGC3, which is largely a healthcare stakeholders meeting. I know Nikki from New Vista participates in that meeting, and a couple of us that kind of work more in this field. It's helpful for me to attend their meetings, but I think vice versa. Sometimes it would be helpful for them to be plugged in and have a presence at our meetings. So I'll definitely follow up on that. Any other folks that we know that we want to be trying to recruit? I guess alternately, is there any interest in us scheduling something that would be more of that kind of open house format meeting to invite new potential stakeholders?
I think that would be cool. I mean, to have the opportunity to reach out to some of the community partners that we may have in the community that aren't truly connected to this but would have overlap, I think that'd be neat to have something actually set aside for it.
Okay. Would we like to do that here in this committee?
I do think it makes sense.
Okay. So the next meeting for this committee would be in February. Obviously, that gets us past the point in time count and the housing inventory count. So I don't immediately know of a ton of items that we have on the agenda. I'd be glad to fold that into our agenda for February if we think that works.
And what would be on the agenda for a meeting like that? What would you think?
I'm open to what that would look like. I think for that, what I would probably propose is taking some of the information, since part of this is related to that recruitment for COC strategies. I think that could be a good opportunity for us to review formally some of our strategies in different areas. It could be a good refresher for our normal partners that are typically in attendance, just to make sure that we are looking at that as a group collectively, and that it's not just this office behind the scenes writing that application that is the primary holder of that knowledge. But also, it would be something that I think would give newer people a little bit of insight into what we are doing and what we would like to do in the future.
I think that sounds great, and I wonder if I think it could make sense for us to maybe fold in some of the folks we've been engaging through the lived engagement committee into a meeting like that. It seems like a good opportunity to get people up to speed. And
Yeah,
also
absolutely.
create space for people to give some input.
Yeah,
for
and,
reactions.
as a reminder, I think we could emphasize the fact that individuals can join the continuum of care as well. So since we have a few people that have come in the last few minutes, we're kind of just opening up. We've approved meeting minutes, and we're just having some discussion to the extent possible with the light attendance about if there's additional partners that we might want to be trying to recruit. And we're thinking about scheduling some time on our February agenda as kind of like a invite a friend kind of meeting where we might reach out to other stakeholders that we think are kind of missing from the table that we'd like to see more participation within the COC. So if you have any thoughts, feel free to chime in. All right. So another item that I wanted to talk about, since it doesn't sound like we have more thoughts on that, is going to be funding priorities for fiscal years 24 and 25. So from our last board meeting, probably are aware that most of our current year funds had been accounted for with things like winter weather response. So moving forward in 25, we will have the change in the ordinance that governs the Innovative and Sustainable Solutions Fund. We're going to be moving from a flat amount to a percentage of the previous year's revenues. We anticipate that's probably going to mean in 25 that we'll have closer to like 1.3 million to work with for that year in programming. But we also, during the fund balance conversation, were awarded an additional $750,000 for this fiscal year. So that means where we had held for winter, and we needed it, we now are getting that money replenished, and we'll be able to go back to the drawing board in terms of what we would like to do in more of a programming space. So as a reminder, we had previously identified that we wanted to put some funding behind landlord recruitment. And I think that is definitely still a need that comes up time and time again. So I do plan to move forward with issuing that RFP after the start of the new year. And then previously we had talked about potentially dedicating some funds to some kind of low barrier interim housing. That item, I think we should definitely consider if we want to move forward with. I know we had some struggles with programs like the TIP program that was with Mountain Comprehensive Care Center. What we found was that a lot of folks didn't need short-term transitional housing, but really needed longer-term, more permanent housing and more intensive supports. It was really difficult to quickly transition people on that TIP model. So given that experience, I'm not certain that would be necessarily the best strategy for us to pursue. But I'm open to talking about whether or not we still want to pursue that, as well as any other ideals that we would have. At this point, it's really just brainstorming, so don't feel uncomfortable to suggest something. We can go and do more research. We can take these ideals and put some information together and present it to the board as a whole. So definitely feel free to throw out any suggestions or ideas that you might have about how we might want to utilize that additional funding.
Jeff, with the low barrier interim housing, would it be feasible to keep some of the good components of that, but then wrap it into something that's more of a transition in place opportunity, where they could actually take over the lease agreement rather than simply occupy it till they find something else or run out of time?
That actually was
Oh, and
the
it didn't
TIP
work.
model.
Oh,
It was,
okay.
it was
just didn't work.
transition in
Oh,
place.
my bad. Yeah.
It was intended to be short-term, that it would be master leased by Mountain Comp and transition to the individual within approximately 3 months. We were willing to extend that time frame, but it was not working that we were seeing people able to transition that quickly. The individuals that Mountain Comp was seeing within their program, for example, had no or little income or income that was unlikely to increase beyond the level that it was. There was oftentimes some pretty high acuity. Some of the things that were barriers to accessing other forms of shelter continued to be barriers to identifying permanent housing. So for that particular program, it didn't work. That's not to say that the model as a whole cannot work with some tweaking, but that was the intended approach, that they would transition to holding that lease on their own.
Okay, and so the barrier was the inability to maintain it afterwards, was the primary one.
That was one of the major barriers. The other one was finding landlords to participate in the program to begin with. We had considered at one point, I said, there's flexibility in the fact that we don't have to continue on master leasing. If you're more able to get landlords to participate in rental assistance, we can operate as rental assistance. And it really didn't make a significant impact in the level of landlords that were willing to participate. There was a lot of concern, I think, from the landlord side of things about not knowing exactly if it was master leasing, who might potentially be occupying that unit and being able to have opportunities to screen tenants. And then master leasing in general, even though we think as providers that you're guaranteeing payment, there's still just a lot of resistance to that model, as I'm sure Christina can speak to, since that's the model that New Beginnings uses for their permanent supportive housing program.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Do you think that something like that applied to a different prioritization might have worked better? So those folks that are far less likely to be placed through typical coordinated entry?
I think that's possible. Right now, the sense that I get is that consistently from providers, we are getting the feedback that the VI SPDAT as a tool is not the best or most reliable indicator of acuity. And that's one of the reasons that we're moving forward with development of our own tool rather than waiting for another prepackaged assessment tool to come along. My suggestion, if we were to consider that, would be to probably wait until we had a new tool in place and had a little bit of time to see if we felt like it was a better indicator of acuity needs. Since it seems like that was one of the strategies that we attempted with TIP, was to try to target lower acuity households, and it did not seem like those were accurate assessments of acuity.
Yeah, that's fair. Do you think then that maybe this pot of funding might be beneficial to allocate towards prevention of homelessness, to stop some of the flow into the system?
That's something that we can consider. And I'll also give the update that we just received a $40,000 donation from Norfolk Southern for the Lexington Homelessness Fund, which is going to mean that that's another topic that I want us to kind of think about in relation to funding, is that originally when Polly had worked on developing the Lexington Homelessness Fund, the hope was that we would be able to raise over $1 million annually to help meet the gap to end chronic homelessness in Lexington. And we've not seen donations nearly at that level. So what I want us to think about going into the new year is different ways that we could utilize that funding to make sure that it's not just sitting in a fund, but to do something that is feasible on the level of donations that we're receiving. One kind of idea that I've already been trying to research how we might potentially implement was something like a flex fund that could be used for purposes like diversion and prevention, or to help persons where there's a minor barrier to moving from homelessness to permanent housing, but maybe something that isn't possible on grant funds. And I know Greenhouse has had some success with operating a flex fund, and a lot of other communities have had some success with either diversion or with ending homelessness for individuals with just nominal amounts of money that are flexible.
Yeah, because I think that could be a really good use for something like that, just because, it's not like we can buy property with that amount of money. So we can't, get around the landlord issue.
Right.
And, our typical programs have enough difficulty as it is. Adding in all those other barriers would be a challenge. But if we could slow the flow into the system itself, that might reduce some of the strain as we work through those that are in it.
Yeah, I think that's particularly relevant in light of the recently released information about the national trends in homelessness. So most of us are aware that locally we saw roughly a 14% increase in our point-in-time count from 22 to 23. And then now nationally information's been released, and the average for the country was a 12% increase. And so for urban areas, I think we fared pretty well in the sense that 14 is pretty close to that average. A lot of the urban areas were reporting, 30% or higher increases in homelessness. So I definitely think you're correct that one of the major talking points in this conversation right now is that we need to be cognizant of the fact that these increases do not demonstrate that communities aren't doing anything to help persons that are in a homeless situation, but that right now there isn't enough resources and protections being dedicated so that when we are housing somebody, there's more than one person flowing into our system at that same time, probably.
Yeah, because it creates a Hydra-like situation. So that's not going to solve it. So yeah, I think that could be good. Thank you.
You said nothing's off the table, so I don't even know if this is something you've talked about before or if it's a good idea, but obviously the problem is we don't have enough affordable housing in Lexington. And we have the Affordable Housing Fund, and they build affordable housing, but a lot of it's not really as affordable for our type of client's income. Is there a way that we could partner with them and sweeten the pot for investors who would want a amount of money to set aside so much of their housing development for people who are entering from homelessness?
I can explore it. What I'll have to do is look at, because we would have the money in the Lexington Homelessness Fund, which would be a little bit more flexible, and then the money in the Innovative and Sustainable. I'll have to make sure that any use wouldn't be prohibited by the ordinance itself. There is some language about how we can use the money, and I just want to make sure, for example, could it be used for capital projects? But even if it couldn't be used in that specific way, maybe there's a way that we could fund through this money services to be paired with some of those properties. I think there are some opportunities to look at what's being done with the Affordable Housing Trust Fund and how we might be able to supplement that or help it go further.
Especially for our clients.
Yeah, the good thing is that, it's all housed in my department, so I can go back and chat with Charlie and Tiffany, and we can kind of put some feelers out and see what might be possible.
closer. I think for the Lexington Homelessness Fund, which is a fairly small amount of money, things like maybe you can move the ID program into that, or funding for birth certificates, and maybe that's just doable with the flex money. But because I think one of these continuing problems that we see is the people having difficulty getting birth certificates. And that could be pretty expensive if they're out of state. So that really becomes a bit of a barrier. Not so much here if they're Kentucky, you know, even though that is money they don't have. But when you're talking, we had a guy getting a birth certificate from Ohio and he needed it in a hurry, so paid like $80. So if you had some money to help with that, I think that would go a long way. Plus, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, which is next winter. So I think we have to talk about like whether or not we're going to spend. I don't want any of it. Don't give any of it to the Hope Center. No. But that is something that I think we should consider before we get into, you know, too far down the road.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the things that I was thinking about with potentially using that for a flex fund, was that we have a pathway for IDs, but now sometimes the barrier is those other items like birth certificates that we need. And I know, well, oftentimes agencies are paying that out of their bottom line and don't have any kind of grant funding that they can use for that purpose. And like you said, it can be costly. I know I had to order mine from out of state for something, and I needed it quickly, and yeah, it's probably $65, $70. Other thoughts, especially if, you know, from those of you that are directly doing client services, you know, Greenhouse, Community Resident Services, New Beginnings, Independence Place, if you guys have recently had any moments, Rescue Mission, if you're sitting around thinking, really wish we had a resource for something, let us know, put it on the table.
It's like, I think just more of like the flex fund would be good, because we've seen like several clients lately with like utility arrears from 15 years ago. And even though it's an apartment with all utilities included, they still aren't able to do it because they have a balance. Application fees, security deposits, things like that. It's one of the big barriers that we run into.
Yeah. And yeah, application fees was one, and we do within LMPCG have a program that's being developed to help with that to some extent, but we can definitely take a look at that.
Hey Jeff, I just want to throw out there that one of the things that I'm encountering more now than I thought I would be, and that is families with kids, young kids and or adult kids, and kids on the street. And I don't know what Lexington, I know there's Arbor Youth, and that's about all I know there is for youth housing. And I know there are several models from Los Angeles and even Colorado Springs, Colorado, for funding for youth housing, strictly youth housing, where they have their own place to go, or if it's a child with or an adult child with a parent, single parent. Is there anything that would allow for funding to be used for youth housing versus other housing usage?
So I would just want to dig a little bit further into, because youth can be kind of broad. One thing is I do hope that we might have the potential to apply for the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program in the coming round. What I've been told from some of my peers is that the outlook for funding is actually improving since other communities have been awarded that money. It's a little bit less competitive, and originally the feedback that we'd gotten on prior applications was that we didn't have a great enough need. So I think we would have a better shot, but we could definitely consider if there's other things. So when you're talking about encountering a need for youth housing, is there specific age groups or a specific type of service or model that you think is needed?
Well, one of the things I'm noticing is teenage, either, you know, from 16 on up, but under 25, but also those that might have medical needs. I know one situation right now, a mother who's doing rehab has a son who's 19, but it also has a rare form of epilepsy, and I was not able to find any housing for him while she's finishing her rehab. So we're kind of in a awkward situation where she's applied for housing, but we have to wait until she gets that for them to be able to live together for her to be a caregiver. So, it's really unique situations sometimes, but, you have adult youth. When I say adult youth, I mean over 16, but under 25, who are probably the most vulnerable as far as finding some type of housing. And if they have a medical issue, it complicates it even more.
Okay. We do have at least one, actually two youth-dedicated rapid rehousing programs in our community. One is going to sit with Arbor through ESG, and one is going to be a COC program that's in partnership with Community Action Council. That one is a joint component transitional housing rapid rehousing program. We'll look a little bit further at some of our data. I know that it's sometimes you're going to be in situations where a resource is not immediately available, but in general, our youth do tend to get referred more quickly sometimes than our single adults. But again, nothing is off the table. We'll definitely consider that as a potential need. Another item that I'll go ahead and throw out, I know in our conversations that I've had one-on-one and here within our meetings with TC from Fayette County Public Schools, is just, kind of the needs that they have. And I know that their definition is different than ours. About 75% of the individuals that are homeless under their definition are actually going to be presently more in marginally housed situations that don't meet our definition. I know that they had done in partnership with Catholic Action the Give Kids a Home fundraiser. What TC expresses to me is that the biggest need is for case management. And so I actually think that that's a need beyond just our youth. I think that people have this notion that case management is just readily available, that it can just happen. It's going to be pulled out of thin air. But in reality, I'm always searching for something within that individual story that helps me find that pathway to case management. Do they have Medicaid, and does their MCO offer some kind of case management? Do they fit a certain subpopulation that I know that there's a provider that can potentially provide that case management? Sometimes it's identifying they have a disability and talking with Independence Place. Sometimes it's identifying they're a survivor and connecting them with Greenhouse for some supports. But sometimes in a situation we don't have that magic piece of information that leads us to being able to connect someone. So a thought would be funding some kind of more general case management that was open to people who aren't already a participant of some kind of a program, like a housing program that can really only serve those that are enrolled through their COC program or their ESG program. And it could be something where it could have a focus. It could be that we focus on helping those families in the public school system. It could be that we focus on people who are transitioning out of institutions. But I would be curious to know, especially from our providers, if you're getting a lot of requests for that as well.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll add to that. The VA has the case management program. They release RFPs for it every year for people that don't qualify for HUD-VASH or don't qualify for SSVO. And I think that sort of catch-all case management would be very helpful for the community because if they become eligible for another service, they can always transfer over. But we have so many people who their housing vouchers dependent on being able to find support services, and we don't have any. They don't really have SMI. They don't really fall in whatever category. So yeah, they fall to the back of the list until we can find something. So I think that would be a great use of whatever funds we have.
Yeah, I think that's another important piece of this conversation is, things like when we do have voucher opportunities that we are trying to identify supportive services to pair with. And I'll be honest, my providers are amazing and being willing to try to step up, but sometimes you just have capacity issues and you can't necessarily continually add, and maybe you're able to do that kind of short-term transitional case management to help get them permanently housed. but oftentimes we don't have the ability to keep that service going if there's not somewhere that can be charged to.
To kind of piggyback with that, I think that in conjunction with a flexible fund and an intelligent prioritization system that could utilize our own, system that's already in place to identify those that are very unlikely for referral, that do not have any supports in place. Especially as we adapt a tool, we could easily create some of these elements to make this easier, to identify who would be best to prioritize for the opportunity for the case management. You could probably leverage people into housing at a pretty high success rate even without a voucher. Because I know, again, different context, but the intensive case management / ASO had a decent housing outcome rate for people who didn't even have vouchers. And that's just because the case management was integrated. And I think that speaks to the possibilities of something like this, especially if instead of solely targeting those with the highest acuity, it's a little bit more distributed amongst the bottom of RRH and the bottom of PSH.
Yeah. I definitely think that as we would potentially move towards a flex fund and flesh out some guidelines for that, I would see those referrals as coming from a case manager. And I think if we have additional case management, that just makes that resource more readily available. Because what I think we would run into if we didn't have some additional case management staff would be, then it becomes difficult on our existing providers and resources to facilitate all of the actual applications and processing of all of those kinds of requests. Yeah. Other thoughts or ideas?
Well, a little bit to piggyback on that but I don't, and maybe it's been tried before, and I don't quite know how the communication could go, but I think a great deal of time that's done by direct service workers is just locating space. So I know Darlene and I had gone to Washington one time, and one of their kind of programs that they were really highlighting was a homeless locator space. So you would call this one number and they would go, well, this shelter has 5 beds and this shelter has 3 beds and this shelter has this. I don't know that we're big enough for that, but I know like if TCs have to call from the school, I know she's having to call multiple people just to kind of see what's available and is it even worthwhile to send this person there. And I don't know if there's anything, I know that there's some data systems or some, kind of networks. And I don't know how good we'd be. Greenhouse 17 would probably be terrible about updating our bed space every day. I mean, it would probably be the worst. But it could help, I think, a great deal. And so it just kind of cuts down probably about a day's worth of work looking for things that are already existing. It's like a networking, it's a dating site.
Yeah. I think the two things that we would kind of have to make sure that we would address in pursuing something like that, one is going to be around just finding someone that's able to actually facilitate in terms of if that's a call center, if that is an application. We need somebody that has the infrastructure to actually operate it efficiently. And then, as you point out, our ability to analyze data is as good as our data itself. So I think definitely would have to improve a little around, we struggle with sometimes just getting stuff like our housing inventory count as an annual submission to be accurate. There's a lot of back and forth, a lot of data validation. So I could imagine some challenges, not to say that we couldn't, but that we definitely have to make that part of whatever package that we would potentially move forward with. But yeah, I mean, should we have to make multiple phone calls to identify a shelter bed?
If I could piggyback off of your piggyback, I just recently discovered, I don't know if any or all of you are familiar with Oxford House. They have a website that is literally what you're talking about, where you can put in your county, and it even breaks it down into sober living houses that are strictly for men, for women, and women with children. And I was able to actually find some transitional housing from a rehabilitation to a sober living like that. It was the easiest thing because otherwise, I mean, it's because I've gone through calling every single shelter in Lexington, Georgetown, Frankfurt. And if they were on the same system as Oxford House, if the shelters could be on that same type of website where they just basically report in, we have the X number of beds, one-stop shop. You can go to that website and it basically gives you a drop-down menu to the county. It gives you a drop-down menu to the type of housing. Bada bing, bada boom, you make a call. I found out they actually had more beds at one house in Winchester than they had on their website, so it was great. I mean, so I've actually had two ladies who were getting ready to go from one place to another, and Oxford House is actually able to help them out.
Okay, something to look at. Any other ideas that we want to do a little bit more research on and potentially push forward?
I'll just, going back to the prevention conversation from earlier, one thing that was on my mind was it could be interesting to talk to Jonathan Wright to see how the court diversion program is going and see if there's anything that they've noticed that would be a gap that's continued that's not addressed through that funding that we could supplement.
Okay.
Briefly on the topic of landlord recruitment, would it be possible to utilize that money kind of similarly to something that I heard KHC was doing for some of their mainstream vouchers? And that would be like not only a bonus at sign-on to work with providers, you know, just like sweetening the pot a little bit, but would there be a way to incorporate some part of an agreement where, you know, a landlord would agree to maybe waive certain background checks for the people who apply for a little bit extra, and then maybe even like an annual bonus for non-eviction or lease renewals of those who are continuing to work with them, because that would incentivize landlords to renew those placements from us. That would incentivize them to not evict for minor things. I don't know if that would actually work or if there's evidence to show that it would, but it could be worth an exploration. Because I think money is really the only thing we can do besides law.
I definitely would like to talk with KHC more to know early on what their experience has been. And personally, I like that approach better than here's just a one-time sign-on bonus. You're going to lease us a unit. Here's some extra money. I understand that that has been helpful in getting landlords to participate in some programs, but it also feels like there's not really a lot of like continued protections or continued participation that come with that. Oftentimes it's we're getting that money and then we may not potentially work with your programs ever again. So I do like the thought that we could somehow incentivize continued participation. And obviously we have partners and neighbors that we can talk to about how they've implemented.
Can I get a clarification what you were talking about as far as background checks? Because I know Lex Housing does background checks on whether or not somebody's been evicted before or hasn't paid rent before. Are we talking criminal background checks, financial background checks?
Any and all, yeah. So I think that, not even saying that they wouldn't do the check itself, but that it would not be a determining factor in if they would approve the individual as long as they can legally occupy the space. Because I can understand from a liability perspective why they might want to ensure somebody's maybe not on the registry and living next to a place like a park or school. But I do think that if we could incentivize them to rent to those with recent felony convictions, or rent to those with recent evictions, or maybe not the best credit score, that could help us a lot in placing the individuals who are actually identified as needing the support the most.
So, like for Lex Housing, for example, they do a pre-screening. I mean, they do a background check. So a landlord, before they rent, they know that.
So when you say Lex Housing, are you talking about the housing authority?
Yeah, well, the voucher program. So I have a lady who's applying right now, and they do have a background check that checks, I guess, if they had not paid rent in the past, or if they had I don't know, bankruptcies. I'm not exactly sure what the background check, it had a number, 412 or something. It was a specific form. This is for, I'm discussing this for COC specifically. So those vouchers typically are utilized with landlords directly. They do not require that the providers themselves run those checks, but the landlords often do. So this would be to incentivize the landlord to not necessarily not run it, but not use that as a determination for if they'd accept that. But if the voucher program does a pre-screening and does that for the landlord, wouldn't that unto itself be an incentive for a landlord? I mean, if we can take them in 10 and say they've applied and they've cleared our hurdles, here's a good tenant that, you know, we've already cleared for you. I think that I see what you're saying, but while it's good for us to know what a person's situation is, we typically rely on their self-report. Sometimes it's wrong. Yeah, you know? True. But usually that's how we would determine who we pursue for housing for that individual. But I think that if we were to run the check itself, it would have a small benefit, at least in my experience, because I'm already kind of doing that just without paying. You know what I mean? Yeah. We're getting that. Which is the other thing, I guess landlords, they have to pay for a background check. They didn't have to pay for it, it was done for them to kind of screen. That might be so. It could be. It depends on if they're taking the property.
And I would just note that in terms of the housing authority, for our COC programs, they typically would have fewer restrictions around. They would potentially still run those checks, but they as kind of Dylan alluded to, they don't hold it against somebody necessarily. Some of the other voucher programs with the housing authority may be subject to regulation at a more federal level that we might not be able to get around, and that's just one type of voucher that's out there. So definitely, we would need to make sure that we don't too much cater that kind of a approach towards one specific housing resource that's in the community. But definitely, I think we've got a lot of different ideals that we've discussed that can help us figure out some pathways to utilize the extra funds that we have. Anything that we haven't gotten to yet that we want to make sure is on the table. All right, so then in the interest of time, we'll keep things rolling. Definitely, you can reach out to me if there's things that we want to chat about a little bit further. I know I'm going to be reaching out to some of you for individual conversations, but we'll have a little bit of time to figure out what to do with this year's money and obviously also look forward to next year. So, Bo, I hope you don't mind, but I wanted to give you a space on the agenda to give us an update on source of income discrimination ban.
Yeah, for sure. So let's see. I'm trying to remember. Yeah, at the last update that I gave was after the I don't know. I'll give an update on what happened at the public meeting. There were about 50 people, I think 46 was the exact number, who came and spoke in support of a ban on source of income discrimination. There were 4 people who spoke against it. So it was much more lopsided than even I expected. What I have heard from council members, I don't know that this is on the agenda yet, but what I've heard is that this will be heard in committee on January 23rd. And that after January, that's the first meeting of social services and public safety. And then after that, it will go to a work session or a council meeting. And then it'll get its 2 hearings if it gets approved out of committee. The fastest timeline that it could pass on at this point is that it would get second reading in mid-February, but it may move even slower than that. And the final opportunity for people to give public comment before that committee meeting is there's a council meeting on January 18th. So if people want to show up on the 18th and let council know that, you're still thinking about this and you still support it, that'd be a good time, because the January 23rd meeting, there won't be any public comment and committee it's possible that the committee ends up voting on it then. So, yeah, that's the timeline and update that I have. Any questions? And also, just thanks. I know there are people here who have done a lot in supporting this and making this happen. So I want to express my appreciation to people for working on that. Any comments, questions?
I know I reached out to several agencies and individuals individually right after the public comment. Just want to echo Bo and just thanking people that have made efforts to support that, to show up to make public comment, to reach out to their council member. I would agree that we definitely had much more voices in public hearing in favor than in opposition, so it was encouraging.
Great. Next on the agenda is Marissa with lived experience engagement.
Thank you. So our last meeting regarding lived experience engagement occurred on November 15th at the library. We discussed a little bit more in depth about what that meeting would look like moving forward. We also talked about coordinated entry. And after that meeting, internally, we had talked about potentially changing the framework of those meetings. Ideally, we wanted to have a subcommittee that would have folks who can think both very big picture as well as the smaller minor details, getting into the weeds of things like funding, right? Talking about COC competition, what exactly that means. So these really pretty intensive discussions and would really require a pretty big capacity for folks to want to be a part of. And something that this office had discussed internally was potentially moving towards having broad quarterly meetings that would be more forum based, and then at those meetings say, our next couple meetings are going to be talking about the particulars of coordinated entry. It's going to be talking about the particulars of funding discussions. If you're interested, here's when and where those meetings will be, to hopefully solicit opinions from folks much more broadly. And then folks who are interested, it's not so selective of having to be connected to a caseworker, an individual who thinks that, hey, this would be a good meeting for you to attend to or attend, but rather much more expansive so that folks can determine this is something that I'm interested in and this is something I want to learn more about. In alignment with that, we talked about both of those, both a broader, more expansive meeting as well as a more granular level, continuing to compensate folks for their lived expertise. We talked about specifically what would it take to make those meetings occur, what types of compensation folks are particularly interested in. So as we enter 2024, moving more towards that type of model to determine if it's more successful than what we've currently experienced. And then ideally, this would be a group that is facilitated by, the agenda is created by folks with lived expertise. So trying to shift the balance away from provider heavy, this office heavy of what information that we're looking for, and shift that into what are those who want to participate are actually interested in discussing, and then making sure that that is parallel with just our natural timeline of items that we have to get done within this office. So I don't know if those who were in attendance have anything to add about our last meeting, but moving forward into 2024, that is what we are currently looking for, kind of thinking through when we want those to be. Also, like I said, making sure that they are parallel to our calendar as well. That way we're not talking about a COC competition in January and the Lex count in June, making sure that those are in alignment, and then hopefully being able to provide that schedule to our folks with lived expertise, making sure that that is displayed. One of the biggest feedback that we received was making sure that the information is displayed as much as possible at the drop-in center, at Lighthouse, at the library, folks where we know that people are hanging out at. So making sure that that is broadcasted wide. That way we can have more folks involved.
Thank you. Questions, comments?
How many people were at the November 15th one?
I think it was a relatively small,
Pretty small number.
group. We did have, I think at least one individual from previous meetings attended. Several of the folks that we had reached out to from previous meetings either did not respond, did not show, but a few did follow up with us to let us know they had a conflict. So we were seeing at least a handful of groups persons that previously participated seem to have an ongoing interest. And so that's part of why we want to mix those larger forums with the smaller, more targeted groups. We think it would help us reach a broad audience and really identify those persons without putting the burden of identification on participants, on providers.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I wonder if it would be useful to like set goal numbers for attendance, especially at the bigger ones, just so that we can like track, how we're doing on turnout and like make a plan for how to get people there.
Yeah, I totally agree. As for this last meeting, I had called both like 3 weeks before, and then a week before, and then like the Monday before, then also sent out several emails to those who provided an email address as well. And I don't think that was the best way to reach folks, obviously, because either they were busy, uninterested, or they were just unable to be reached by the methods that they provided to us. So I agree. I think having a set goal and then making sure that we tell folks that this is for anybody who is involved. And then if we continue to see the same folks who are really interested, especially in more of the micro level discussions, not quite such the big, broad, just general gaps in the system, but more so I want to talk about like what Housing First actually means, for example, or what low barrier specifically means. Then I think, if we have folks who are continually showing up, then we may revisit this idea of having like a subcommittee that is very defined with specific roles. But I think that casting the net more broadly, having those goals of just getting as many people interested, involved, and able to have a sense of what our vision is, that way then they can let us know this is actually what the vision should be.
Yeah, and another thing that I'm thinking about as you talk about these bigger, broader meetings is that getting that input for me would be really useful, for example, for like the conversation that we just had about funding priorities for 24 and 25. So I'm like thinking about what are the ways that we can ensure that we're like capturing what's said in those big picture conversations well, and like turning it into, I don't know, like a 1-page report that gets read out at the next HPI meeting, or, that we like have on file for whenever, discussions like this come back up again, so that even if people aren't at this meeting, we know what they were saying.
I think like an anonymous survey being an option as part of it with some of those more question-based things might help with some of that data. And I mean, I thought that even though it was a small group, the meeting went really well. I do think that when we switch to a bigger one, we may want to come up with a system to redirect back to topic. I'm sure you all thought the same thing, but just want to mention it.
Yeah, I think so too.
I'll say, I mentioned this to Kelly and Phil Gunning over at NAMI and asked that they kind of put it out at Participation Station, but it was like maybe 2 days before, so I don't know if it was ample time to get that out, but if you can have some people that are already involved with NAMI, you're probably likely to get people who are more engaged and likely to be willing to participate because they're already doing that elsewhere. So, so sharing that with the Gunnings and getting it posted at participation station, you may get more involvement there.
Absolutely. And I also think that having different levels of participation and involvement, having folks who are really involved versus just folks who are like potentially want to like air out grievances at, you know, a more broader meeting. I think that both are pretty valid. So.
All right, I think we're still with you, but now for program standards update.
So in the packet, you should find your rapid rehousing standards. Those are on beginning on page 6. But I wanted to first speak a little bit more broadly about where we're currently at. As per our calendar, we have obviously conducted our rapid rehousing standards meeting review. We also just had our permanent supportive housing standards review. That first meeting occurred on November 29th. We have had one follow-up meeting since then. And then we are having one more meeting. There should be a quicker meeting, just to review those permanent supportive housing standards that will be going out via email. And then our goal for that would be to have that meeting take place in January, have a final round of that draft document go around to our permanent supportive housing providers, and then thereafter bring that to our February meeting. We have a street outreach program standards review that will occur March 27th, 2024, and then in May 22nd, 2024, our emergency shelter standards review will occur, bringing it back to our rapid rehousing standards. Again, you can find those at page 6. These are some standards that went through several meetings, several Zoom meetings, an in-person meeting, and then the document was shared widely, so drafts and changes have been made. Additional language has been put into these rapid rehousing standards pertaining to those with lived expertise, expanding that, making sure that we are also, that our case management standards are explicit and a little bit more defined as well. Other changes that we talked about were within participant grievances and more broadly that section pertaining to termination, making sure that we included things to be explicitly provided to those who are participating in rapid rehousing programs, because it says that participant will understand the program, but also making sure the participant has a copy of those requirements, things of that nature. So I'm happy to open the floor for any questions or concerns. We will need to vote on it, and it is a full continuum of care membership vote. But okay, if there are no questions, then.
Okay, can we get a motion for approval of the rapid rehousing standards?
So moved.
Is there a second? Bruce, second. All right.
Second.
All those in favor, please signify by saying aye or raising your right hand.
Aye.
Any opposed? And any abstentions? I forgot that earlier. If you abstain from the minutes also, you can let me know. Okay, great. Passes. And next, back to Jeff for IDs for those experiencing homelessness.
All right. So we've been doing updates each meeting on our state ID assistance, which we started back in March. So overall, funding, I know it's going to look a little bit strange in the sense that we still have that significant gap between the letters that are issued and those that are redeemed. We had originally allocated just over $1,200, and we've expensed almost $600 of that. We have about $1,400 that's currently tied up in letters that could potentially be redeemed. I think most of them are not going to be redeemed at this point. They've probably been lost or stolen, or persons maybe don't have a clear plan on getting that redeemed right away. If it was to happen, I can definitely, we already talked about committing some funds out of fiscal year 24. So, I mean, it's not an issue if we run through that initially committed amount. If we were going on that amount, we've overextended a little bit, but just based on those that are redeemed, we still have a significant amount that would be remaining, about half of what we originally dedicated. We've also been kind of talking about what that rate of redemption is, and it continues to improve. Not as significant a jump as our last update, which was around 33%, up from, I want to say, maybe 24% before that. So this update, we're just a little over 34% of those letters being redeemed. We also have a lot of agencies that have facilitated a lot of requests lately, like New Vista, for example, which is going to be our largest number of referrals to that program, with over 100 individuals referred, and they're running nearly a 40% redemption rate. Don't have a lot of other updates. Nothing has changed since the portion of House Bill 21 that reduced the cost went into effect on July 1. We do still occasionally have some issues specifically around individuals' legal name. Just make sure that you try to the full extent possible to submit the actual legal name that's on file for an individual. Sometimes I know there are some name changes and things that can occur. Sometimes, depending on what that experience has been at redeeming, sometimes the worker might go ahead and push that request through, even if the legal name has changed. Sometimes it may not. And I just like to try to reduce any barriers that we can so that it increases the likelihood of someone's going to get access to the resource that they need. But overall, we're continuing to get a lot of those IDs out. Are there questions or comments about the ID program? All right. If not, then I'll just go ahead and also make an announcement that tomorrow evening we are going to be holding our National Homeless Persons Memorial Day event in Tandy Park. It's going to be at 5:30 p.m. We included flyers in English and Spanish in your packet. Right now, we have several folks from the Continuum that are planning to join us. Councilmember Legree is going to present a proclamation from Mayor Gordon. We definitely hope to see some folks come out and join us as we honor those that have passed away without a home, and also kind of just, as we go into the new year, rededicate ourselves to this work. I know sometimes it can be hard when we think about things like the fact that several of us have probably lost clients that we've worked with, and sometimes we see discouraging statistics, like the increases in homelessness, or the recently released report around those working in this field and the extremely high rates of turnover and the number of persons working in this field that are themselves at risk of potential homelessness. So sometimes we need those opportunities to clear the slate and to think positive and remember why we do what we do. So definitely consider coming out to join us tomorrow evening. So that is the bulk of our agenda items. Are there announcements or public sharing?
I would just like to also add that at the very end of your meeting packet, there should be a link, a QR code, and a link to sign up for the Lex count. So please do so. Great, thanks. I do not know, but I can tell you what items we are still in need of. We are still in need of scarves and deodorant. instant coffee, and collapsible cups. So those are the items that I've not yet received any notification that anyone is interested in providing. So again, scarves, plenty of scarves, instant coffee, collapsible cups, and deodorant.
We've also moved in the last 2 years to the Rescue Mission has offered opportunities for people to pick up their packets in advance of the count, which has been helpful. But we still do have some teams that don't have an opportunity to pick those up during business hours. So if any board members do have an interest, we would be glad to have you help us out with kind of check in, check out at the Rescue Mission the evening of the count. We encourage people if they want to go out in the field, we're definitely glad to try to pair you with other persons. If you want to go out with providers or someone from police, someone that makes you feel more comfortable going out to the field, we're glad to look at any level of participation that you might want to have.
We may have deodorant. I'll double check. But how many do you need? About 75? Is that what I saw? Okay, I'll double check. Unrelated to that, and I don't know any details about this, but I feel like I was reading the crime bill that was maybe going to be addressed by the Republican Party that had put forward in Kentucky, and there was a section about people on the street and penalizing people blocking sidewalks, and it just seemed not a supportive
So
spot.
this is a good topic for us as an advocacy group to be talking about. Going into the legislative session after the start of the year, there is a new draft of the Safer Kentucky Act, which was released on Friday of last week. We had already been concerned about the Safer Kentucky Act for how it was going to impact things like those that might be unsheltered. It does have some anti-camping language in that document, and also it could take away local government's power in terms of whether or not they enforce on that. It definitely would be something that we would be concerned about as criminalizing homelessness and making it more difficult for people to obtain permanent housing. In addition to that, there is some language that is kind of stand your ground-ish in terms of if there is somebody that is camping in a public or private space and they've been asked to leave and they become threatening in any way, that basically you're justified in using force against them. And then finally, that something that would be of concern for a lot of us, but in particular for LFUCG and for KHC, there also appears to be some anti-housing first language in that document, which would attempt to limit our ability to provide federal funding to programs that do not require participation in substance treatment and mental health treatment. KHC, the Louisville Coalition, Adrienne Bush from HHCK, and some representatives from LFUCG are already planning to get together for a meeting early in the start of the new year so that we can map out how we collectively, as the three continuums within the state, want to respond to that. I know Charlie and myself are already working on trying to develop some easy talking points that we can put into a one-pager that would just kind of really break things down and be accessible to a large group that maybe aren't as familiar with terms like housing first and why we'd be concerned about some of these items. Also hearing from participating in the Kentucky Interagency Council on Homelessness policy call this morning, beyond the housing and homelessness aspect of this, I believe there's other groups that are already concerned about a number of other areas of civil liberties that are within that document. And I've already heard some affectionately refer to this instead of Safer Kentucky as Incarcerate Kentucky, because it seems like it would result in a lot of potential issues, not just for our population, but for other populations as well. So I'm glad you raised that point. It's definitely something that was on the radar, but now is something we really need to have an organized response to. I'm sure that we may be bringing some additional items back to this group, potentially, social media campaigns, information, talking points, links to identify your elected officials, how you can reach out, how you can advocate against this. Unfortunately, that may be needed.
I have a question about the housing first piece. How would they mandate substance use treatment or serious mental illness treatment or mental health treatment for individuals receiving these funds if they're not aware if they have the diagnosis to begin with?
So essentially what it would do is it would limit our ability to give federal funding to programs if they do not require that participation.
So it would be required regardless of a person's actual situation.
I don't think that they're necessarily thinking at that level. This is largely going to mirror Representative Barr's Housing Plus Act that he'd attempted previously to get passed. He's not the biggest proponent of the Housing First model, and largely believes that it is just warehousing people and that it's not doing anything to actually address their needs. Essentially viewing it as housing only instead of housing first, with those same supports being offered, but just on a voluntary basis. I don't think that it's a consideration about the actual needs of the individual. I think it is more of a higher level attack on the philosophy.
And I presume, as is often the case, there's absolutely no data that they've even produced to support their opinion, correct?
I mean, obviously that doesn't appear in the draft. I don't think that that's necessarily where we would see it. I know there are some various claims that Representative Barr has made and trying to pitch Housing Plus in the past, but I don't remember any specific data points. They may have been there, and I just may not remember them. But it seemed to me a lot of it was like anecdotal.
Do we have a sense of the best way to sway? Like, I assume data is probably not going to sway their opinion, not that we shouldn't necessarily provide it, but would there be a way to sway through small government approach? What would be the method?
So I think there's some different approaches. One thing, Kitsch seems to be kind of taking the approach that it might be beneficial to really just work on modifying some of the language so that we could potentially mitigate some of the more negative consequences that we are afraid of, but make the anti-housing first crowd feel as if they are still getting a win by not like removing things altogether, but just if we were to phrase it in a certain way, like if we could change the language to, instead of require that participation, if we can say, provide access to, because in theory and in practice, that is what we are already doing. It's just on a voluntary basis instead of mandated. And so then, that's one strategy. I know other strategies would be, trying to put feelers out by actually working with folks inside that might be able to give us a sense of how likely it is to pass. And then, like you said, I don't think that necessarily statistics might not be the most convincing. I know things that we are probably going to focus on are going to be things like talking about the fact that those supports are already a part of the Housing First approach. Also talking about things like by requiring, you might increase the length of time that persons are actually in a homeless situation, and then they're going to, for example, utilize costly emergency services. I hate to always rely on money, but unfortunately that is something that does seem to sway. So that's another approach is to compare what that might look like in terms of an economic impact.
Also that we may lose some of those federal dollars that they're talking about, which actually require you to be housing first. So
Yeah.
again, why be
Yeah,
tied
another
up with the rules? And
major-
I'm here for the Incarcerate Kentucky shirts. If we're going to protest, I will have I'll be in charge of that.
That's definitely another of the actual points, is that essentially what we would be doing is putting ourselves in a situation where we are at odds between what the federal strategy is, and then we would have something at the state level that would effectively prevent us from being able to do that. I think that with things like our COC funding, we may potentially have a loophole in that even though we run a local competition, those dollars are actually a direct subcontract between the provider and HUD itself. But I don't want to rest too comfortably, but I think that is potentially something that might save some of our resources. But then when I think about things like emergency solutions grant, that is a true pass through. So if that act was to pass with that draft language, there could be some impact to things like ESG funding and some things that do provide significant contributions to our system. And I believe KHC has more funding than we do, just in general, but that is specifically going to be passed through.
I'm going to kill a few birds with one stone here because I know we're kind of getting to the community comment type of thing. My name's Eric Evans, and I am the new housing advocate for Independence Place. But I have been an advocate for going on 2 very long or more decades. And some of what I'm hearing as far as requiring mental health or requiring certain things in any kind of a bill, I've always known to be a barrier than it is anything else. And that's the kind of language we need to use, is saying this is not helping. It's actually, people are not going to want to do something if they're being told they're required to do this. We ran into the same thing. So I've been an HIV/AIDS advocate for 25 plus years, and this is the same thing we had back in that time when they were trying to pass bills saying, well, you can't get this unless you're forced to do that. And the kind of thing, like I talked with AVOL recently, and their mantra now is housing is healthcare, which is something that we should really take to heart, is the fact that a lot of the people that we're finding housing for have healthcare needs. And that's a way to turn this kind of back around on them and saying you can't require somebody to do something, but you can offer them, say, we can give you housing if we can help you with healthcare. And that way it actually is a win-win for our side, because we get them that healthcare they need, but they also get the housing that they need. So that's just a couple of my suggestions as a 61-year-old advocate who's been doing this much longer than I thought I would be. Right, I never wear them.
Underneath my sweatshirt, I have my housing as a human right shirt on. Other announcements or public sharing? All right, if not, we have a motion to adjourn.
Just real quick, I want to thank you for inviting me today, and as long as I'm going to be involved in this arena, let me know if anything else I can do to be involved and to help through my piece as being a disabilities advocate for housing for Independence Place.
We appreciate you being here. Okay, all right. Do we have a second? Do we need a second?
I'll second.
Thank you all. Happy holidays too.